I'm delighted to welcome back to XJTLU today Professor David Punter of the University of Bristol. Welcome back, I say, because David has had a long association with the departments of English here at XJTLU. He was a plenary speaker at our language colloquium back in 2019. Since 2021, he's been an honorary professor here in the new Department of Literature. I'm particularly delighted to be chairing this talk because I've known and been working with David since way back when I was an early career fellow at the University of Bristol in 2007, when I had the first opportunity to benefit from his advice, his wisdom and his experience. And I had the rare opportunity to be edited by him in one of the books shown on the screen here, his fantastic Edinburgh Companion to Gothic and the Arts. As students on Gothic courses will know, that book, as well as David's veritable library of others, all the way back to the literature of terror in 1980, those are absolutely indispensable to study of contemporary Gothic and the quarter millennium of the Gothic literary tradition. David is truly a giant in the world of Gothic studies, and it's an honor to be able, for a moment at least today, to climb up and peek over his shoulder. David Punter is Professor of English at the University of Bristol. He's published extensively on Romantic, Gothic, modern and contemporary literature, as well as on psychoanalysis and critical theory. His best known book on the Gothic is The Literature of Terror. His more recent authored and edited works include Writing the Passions, 2001, Rapture, Literature, Addiction, Secrecy, 2009, The Literature of Pity, 2014, The Gothic Condition, Terror, History and the Psyche, 2016, The Edinburgh Companion to Gothic and the Arts, and Spaces of the Fantastic in 2021. David is also a prolific poet with 8 poetry collections to his name, including Stranger, published by Cinnamon Press in 2021. His talk for us today is on Bodies and Blood, Thoughts on the Contemporary Gothic. David, over to you.
Well, thank you, Tom, very much indeed for that that fulsome introduction. And good morning, or afternoon, or evening, as the case may be. It's a pleasure to be here, and I'm just sorry that I couldn't be present in person. I'd like today to speak a little about 2 recent Gothic novels. The first is His Bloody Project, published by the Scottish writer Graeme Macrae Burnet in 2015. And the other is Frankenstein in Baghdad by the Iraqi writer Ahmed Saadawi, first published in Arabic in 2013 and then translated into English in 2018. These are very different books, but they do have some things in common, as I hope we shall see. One of the things I'm most concerned with is the way in which they hark back to, and even in some ways recycle, ideas and motifs from earlier Gothic fictions. In the case of Frankenstein in Baghdad, obviously Mary Shelley's original novel Frankenstein, first published in 1818. In the case of His Bloody Project, the novel called The Private Memoirs and Confessions of a Justified Sinner, written by James Hogg and first published in 1824. I hope it will also emerge that both texts are deeply concerned with questions of justice and authority, with whose version of events goes down as historical truth, if there can be such a thing. I'll begin with His Bloody Project, but first I need to say a little bit about the history of Scottish Gothic. I'll keep it very brief. As you all probably know, Scotland is a complex place. It's not fully independent, but is part of the United Kingdom, yet has a long independent history. The question of whether it has its own language is a vexed one, which still excites controversy today. There is an older language, Gaelic, which is entirely separate from English, but is now spoken by very few people. Most people in Scotland now speak Scots, but whether Scots is a separate language from English or merely a dialect is difficult to determine. Scotland has also been for many centuries the site of religious conflict between various varieties of Protestantism and Catholicism. Above all, one might say that Scotland is a place haunted by its own past, and this past is rich and varied. It's been and partially remains a hotbed of industrial and post-industrial revolution, the home of generations of inventors and engineers, while it also remains home to some of those apparently unspoiled, or some would say undeveloped, spaces in Europe. The highlands, the islands, the remote country, we can see as haunted by the possibilities of urban life. The cities are haunted by memories of a less civilized, more barbarous past. All territorialization, the theorists Gilles Deleuze and Félix Guattari would say, is in the unending condition of flight. Here's a brief quote from them. Multiplicities are defined by the outside, by the abstract line, the line of flight or deterritorialization, according to which they change in nature and connect with other multiplicities. This is a difficult concept. But what the authors seem to mean is that all that is here, the present, the concrete, is shadowed and indeed formed by flight, by the attempt to escape. Or to put it in a different but more obviously contemporary way, a nation forms its very image in the shadow of those who leave it as much as those who remain. In the case of Scotland, for example, it's said there are more people now of Scottish ancestry in Canada than there are in Scotland itself, which is the result in large part of the process known as the Highland clearances, whereby large landowners in the 19th century, seeking to develop their land, threw large numbers of peasant families off their land, forcing them to emigrate. The reason I'm mentioning these historical details, which I hope you don't find too boring, is to reinforce the idea of a haunted Scotland, haunted by the violence of its own past, an all too obviously Gothic motif. It's also to provide a little background to his bloody project. Now, his bloody project is an appalling, violent, and in my view, brilliant novel set in the Scottish Highlands during the late 19th century. The protagonist, Roderick Macrae, has been arrested for the signally brutal killing of a family consisting of 3 of his neighbours in a remote village called Culdewy. But the story is told through an intricate series of interlinked documents, including statements by the villagers, Roderick's own account of the fatal event, to which he has freely admitted, and the other events leading up to it, medical reports, and an apparent transcript of his trial itself. There's also a preface signed GMB, which of course are Burnet's own initials, which purports to detail the research by means of which the documents came into the hands of the author. What are we to make of this wealth of narrative material? The reader is led through a series of prior events that arise from a feud between Roderick's family and their crofting neighbours, the Mackenzies. These events include the repeated rape and eventual pregnancy of Roderick's sister, which results in her suicide, the Mackenzies' unremitting attempts to force Roderick's father off his ancestral land, and Roderick's own inability to escape from the harrowing, claustrophobic confines of crofting life. I'll come back to crofting in a moment. Even though it's recommended by his teachers that he has the mind and the skill to go on to greater things through further education, albeit an education that would involve urban relocation, a possibility of which Roderick cannot truly conceive. Here indeed, we have the motif of a place haunted by its other, and the gap between them proves impossible to cross. Crofting, I should explain that crofting is a specific form of peasant farming. Scottish crofters did not own the land they farmed, but were always at the mercy of their landlords, which is why the Highland clearances were possible. Their plots of land were very small, and in general they endured the very worst kind of subsistence life, graphically displayed in His Bloody Project. Now, behind this story, there lies a whole panoply of Gothic sources, or at least progenitors. The most obvious example, as I just mentioned, is James Hogg's Private Memoirs and Confessions of a Justified Sinner. This is a book similarly recounted in a complex, fragmented style, such that the reader remains in a state of continuing uncertainty regarding event and belief. Hogg is concerned with the religious and the supernatural, whereas Burnet is only too preoccupied with the entirely physical, with the brute, unrelenting, and in some cases pointless work involved in keeping the crofts going, even though it turns out that this is only to the benefit of their master and his local factor. In the Confessions, in James Hogg's book, we hear the story of one Robert Ringham. It's told first by an anonymous editor, and then again by Ringham himself. In the first account, we find Ringham to be a man whose behaviour is almost inexplicable. He is violent and unpleasant to almost everybody he encounters. His own account, though, is very different. He makes it seem as though all of this behaviour has been because of his friendship with a mysterious man known as Gil Martin, who has egged him on in this outrageous behaviour by convincing Ringham that Ringham is, according to the principles of the extreme form of Protestantism known as Calvinism, already saved by God. Being saved by God means that nothing he does can be truly evil. All his actions and crimes are justified in the name of a greater religious good, as is said in the book's title. But the doubts and uncertainties in the novel mainly hinge on whether Gil Martin is actually real, insofar as one can be real in a novel, which is not very far, or a figment of Ringham's religiously fervent imagination, or indeed on whether he is a Gothically supernatural figure representing the devil in some shape or form. Now, in His Bloody Project, we find ourselves similarly entertaining different accounts of what has actually gone on in the village leading up to the murders. Is our protagonist, Roderick, telling the truth about the dire insults and injuries he says have been done to his family? Or is he exaggerating in order to justify his actions? We hear in the novel of excruciating repeated attempts made to have those in authority hear the hideous reality of the feud, but these attempts are repulsed at every turn. So that it seems as though, as also in Justified Sinner, we can never really know the truth of events. We are lost in a maze or labyrinth. And that image of the maze or labyrinth, where the truth, the core, can never be found, is something you might want to keep in mind as I talk on. If we think of other Gothic parallels, we may feel we can hear also in this the anguished tones of Caleb in William Godwin's Caleb Williams of 1794, who was similarly unable to have his case heard because of the institutionalization of class prejudice. But Burnet goes further than this, because there is little doubt that the crofters, the peasant farmers, are regarded by their superiors, in inverted commas, not merely as a lesser kind of human, as Caleb is, but actually as animals. To take but one example, a visitor to the village of Culduri comments that and I quote, the majority of houses, if they can be termed as such, were of such rude construction that one would have taken them for byres or pigsties. Byres are places to keep cattle. Those who profit from their labour treat most of the villagers' words, no matter how articulately expressed or loudly protested, as having no bearing on reason or truth, which is crucially different from the way in which they treat the words that come from the mouths of those like the rival group, the Mackenzies, who seek their own profit, minuscule though it may be, by relying on their master's will and instructions. Further than this, it's necessary to consider the account of Roderick's trial. This is a parody of what we might now consider to be just legal process. And it hinges on one question and one only, and that is whether Roderick was of sound mind when he committed his indisputably appalling crimes. James Bruce Thompson is an expert witness who is brought in to testify. He's based on a real person, known for his series of articles on the criminal mind, which are cited in the text, think of Lombroso, and he delivers himself with the following opinions when asked to dilate upon how to identify members of a so-called hereditary criminal class. Again, the words are in inverted commas. And this is the first quotation that Professor Duggett has kindly put up on the screen for us. Due to the filthy conditions in which these colonies breed, and their lack of regard for rules of consanguinity, there is also found among them abnormal states, such as spinal deformities, stammering, imperfect organs of speech, club feet, cleft palates, hair lips, deafness, congenital blindness, epilepsy, scrofula, and so on. All this accompanied by weakness of mind or imbecilism. Those born in crime are as distinct from an honest working man as a black-faced sheep is from the Cheviot breed. What follows from this statement is not sufficiently clear as to place Roderick, who is clearly an intelligent young man, within this stereotyped group. But the work of prejudice has been done, and in a fashion that brooks no rebuttal. Roderick is caught in a web whereby the only alternatives are committal to a mental institution or hanging. The sins of the fathers, the blood feud that persists down generations, the claustrophobia that follows from a small inbred community, the sacrifice of innocent women as pawns in a masculine power struggle. These are some of the themes familiar from so much earlier Gothic, present in Burnet's novel. But I want to turn a little aside at this point and say something about Scottish Gothic and the supernatural. A number of recent Scottish novelists, James Kelman and Irvine Welsh, to take the two best examples, have been described as Gothic, yet there is nothing of the supernatural about them. We might think, for instance, of Kelman's How Late It Was, How Late, 1994, or Irvine Welsh's Train Spotting, 1993. Of course, in one sense, this is unsurprising. Although Gothic has often had to do with the supernatural, the phantomatic, the undead, it doesn't always do so, and there are plenty of other definitions of Gothic available. But it might be possible to say that something of what holds these Scottish novelists together, and Burnet is no exception, is what we might call a sense of the labyrinthine, as I mentioned a little earlier. And this is what also connects them back to the world of Hogg. In His Bloody Project and the private memoirs and confessions of a justified sinner, we are lost in a labyrinth. We are confronted with versions of the truth that contradict each other, and we are given too little certain evidence to make up our minds conclusively in one direction or another. This is quite unlike the worlds of so many modern and contemporary writers of fantasy. If we think of, say, Tolkien's The Lord of the Rings, then we have there a world which is all too susceptible to mapping. The book comes with maps attached. The worlds of Gothic in general are not susceptible to mapping. It will be as fatuous to attempt a precise geography of Anne Radcliffe's castle of Udolpho, or the more recent castle of Gormenghast in Mervyn Peake's famous trilogy, as it would be to find a precise geography of so many haunted houses. Even in the interesting case of Stephen King's The Shining, well, it interests me, despite the apparently meticulous description of the corridors and lobbies of the Overlook Hotel, as the protagonist and thus the reader move within this world, shapes change and shimmer. Rooms are not where they were before. Routes prove delusive and malleable, as they are continually haunted by past memories of what might initially appear to be the same spaces. In these spaces, we are not able to map ahead. We are instead continually in flight. And here there is a significant symmetry between history and geography. What we are in flight from is always around another corner, usually behind us. At the same time, it is the ghosts of the past which pursue us through these terrorizing spaces. Ghosts which may inhabit a different parallel world, yet one that continually threatens to erupt into our apparent normality, as the skeletons in the closet rise up and we fear may eventually surround us. I think I'm getting a bit carried away there. Let me take one more specific and highly resonant example from Scottish Gothic. Sammy, the protagonist of Kelman's How Late It Was, How Late, is blind. And to him, the city streets are a continuing labyrinth or maze to be negotiated. In perhaps a less literal sense, we could also say that Irvine Welsh's characters are caught in a nightmare version of Edinburgh, for which there is never any real escape. Or if there is escape, it's only a prelude to an inevitable return. And so this sense of the labyrinthine is continually on the verge of the generalizations of haunting and the specificities of landscapes, whether urban or rural, which we feel we may have known and seen clearly in some past life, but which now prove unnameable on the maps with the aid of which we now seek to negotiate them. Let me try for a moment to clarify what I've been trying to say about His Bloody Project and its relation to the private memoirs and confessions of a justified sinner. I've spoken of both texts being labyrinths and having to do with issues of justice. It's also true that both texts have to do with mental delusion. Graeme, in Justified Sinner, may or may not be deluded, though it appears highly probable that he is. Roderick, in His Bloody Project, probably isn't, but we cannot be certain of this either, because he's obviously been propelled into states of extremity, states of high emotion by the actions of the rival family. And behind this, there lies a further question, and it's one that goes, I think, to the heart of the Gothic. Is it ever truly possible to think of a criminal, especially a murderer, as fully sane? The law does this all the time, but does not sanity involve drawing limits around our actions and having regard for the sanctity of human life, no matter how far we are provoked? Gothic can't provide answers to these questions, but it can provide us with insights into the human in its most extreme conditions. And though I suggested that his Bloody Project, despite being Gothic in several ways, is not a book with much to do with the supernatural, this isn't entirely true. Tom, have the second quote up here. Lovely. Early in the novel, Roderick's mother dies, but we learn this. In addition to her likeness to my mother in appearance and character, my sister Jetta shared with her a great sensitivity to the other world. Whether she had been born with this gift or had learned it from some secret teachings of mother, I cannot say. But both were prone to visions and were greatly concerned with omens and charms. On the morning of her brother's death, this happens before the novel starts, my mother saw an empty place on the bench where he should have been sitting at his breakfast. Fearing that his porridge would grow cold, she went outside and called him. When he did not answer, she went back inside and saw him at his place at the table, shrouded in a pale grey winding sheet. When she asked where he had been, he replied that he had been nowhere other than the bench. She begged him not to go to sea that day. But he is a fisherman, and he does go to sea, and there he is drowned. So there is a supernatural tinge to the tale, as there is in so much Scottish Gothic, and as of course there is to the portrayal of the character who may or may not be Gil Martin in Hogg's Justified Sinner. Another point that emerges from this, Roderick's mother, whose name is Una, is like everybody else in the book, seen from a number of different perspectives. Roderick, as we have seen, portrays her as genuinely involved in a world of omens and portents. The minister of the local church or kirk sees her entirely differently. Next quotation, please, Tom. This is the local minister testifying about Roderick's upbringing and condition. And I wish I could do a Scottish accent, but I'm not going to even try because it would just be embarrassing. The boy's mother, Una Macrae, was a frivolous and insincere woman. She attended church regularly, but I fear she mistook the Lord's house for a space of social gathering. I frequently heard her singing on her way to and from the kirk, and after service she would gather within the grounds with other womenfolk and indulge in intemperate conversation and laughter. On more than one occasion, I was obliged to reprimand her. Now, we may of course feel that this tells us more about the Reverend James Galbraith, and indeed about the church in Scotland at the time, than it does about Una Macrae. But the point is that we again find ourselves in a labyrinth, perhaps in a labyrinth of reflections like a hall of mirrors, in which it's impossible to form a true or complete image of any individual character or event. I'll now turn to my second text, Frankenstein in Baghdad. I don't know, of course, how much any of you here knows about it. As I said before, it's written in Arabic by Ahmed Saadawi in 2013 and translated into English 5 years later in 2018. Although in 2014, it had made Saadawi the first Iraqi winner of the prestigious International Prize for Arabic Fiction. Once translated, it was immediately shortlisted for the Man Booker International Prize. Set, of course, in Baghdad, in the war-torn years 2003 to 2005, the novel begins from the contentious claim of an alcoholic junk dealer, Hardy, that he has constructed a creature from the bits and pieces of broken bodies he finds every day excuse me, on the war-torn streets of the city. This contention of his, that he's constructed this creature or monster, is never fully validated. Hardy is a known liar and storyteller, and rarely certain of his own memories. Amid a large cast of other characters, our main point of focalization is through a young journalist called Mahmoud. Mahmoud runs across the trail of this supposed creature at several points and in several different ways, leaving a trail of destruction. All the while he, Mahmoud, is having to struggle with the uncertainties of following a journalistic calling in a city where news is rarely verifiable and almost never true. Rarely verifiable and almost never true. I thought of putting that as an epigraph to this lecture. It's a great strength of the novel, Frankenstein in Baghdad, that few of the uncertainties are resolved. In terms of the central motif of Frankenstein's creature, is there really a creature, a monster? Or is he merely the stuff of people's fantasies, and in many cases their wishes? Does he actually appear and commit acts of violence? Or is he more to be thought of as an incarnation of the terrible and ubiquitous violence of Baghdad during these troubled years? If we take a less supernatural example of the uncertainties in the novel, the ubiquitous and extraordinarily violent police tell Mahmoud at one point that his newspaper boss and mentor, who disappeared, took with him $13 million of embezzled aid money. Should Mahmoud believe them? Or is this merely a reflection of the gossip and rumours that constantly circulate in a war-torn city where nothing is reliable and almost anything may be believed? The book has a weird form of what we might loosely call punctuation, though not in the literal sense. Namely, the explosion. Every so often, a narrative line develops, but then it's entirely disrupted or even reversed by a bomb. But the appearance and temporal sequencing of these bombs is never entirely clear. Sometimes it seems to be a sequence of different bombs. At other times, it could well be the same bomb, the same explosion, seen from different perspectives. And the bomb, obviously, is an instrument of death. In what follows, I mainly want to read out and comment on some passages from the novel. And the first one has to do, it's already on screen, thank you very much, Tom. The first one has to do with what Saadawi and I are calling the death machine. that occurs in the context of mass deaths around an incident on a Baghdad bridge. Though whether this was caused by a suicide bomber or by an uncanny gathering of 1,000 ghosts remains unclear. All the security incidents and the tragedies we're seeing stem from one thing: fear. The people on the bridge died because they were frightened of dying. Every day we're dying from the same fear of dying. The groups that have given shelter and support to Al-Qaeda have done so because they are frightened of another group. And this other group has created and mobilized militias to protect itself from Al-Qaeda. It has created a death machine working in the other direction because it's afraid of the other. And we're going to see more and more death because of fear. And what all of us here will know, because we're all scholars of the Gothic, is that the multiple deaths in the original novel Frankenstein were caused by fear. By the creature's fear of isolation, by Victor's fear of the creature, or by the overall fear which the creature's appearance inspires in almost all he meets. So here we have an apparently unending cycle of fear. In fact, in the novel, and this is one of its main strengths, I think, there is some considerable mitigation of this enveloping terror because there still remain in Baghdad thoroughly integrated communities, of which our old friend Victor Frankenstein was never really part in the original novel, isolated as he was from family, friends, and any kind of wider community. In Frankenstein in Baghdad, neighbours may have hated each other for decades, but they're still deeply embedded in each other's lives. All this has to do, as it does in Mary Shelley's novel, with family. And here is something of Saadawi's thinking on family. Put up the next quote, please, Tom. That's it. I should explain that the junk dealer referred to here is, of course, Hardy, who has perhaps or has dreamed that he has put the creature together. Elishva, who is referred to here, is an Assyrian Christian. She is seen as the creature's mother in the peculiar sense that her absolute faith that her own son Daniel, who was killed in the Iran-Iraq war 20 years previously, will return. That faith of hers in this impossibility of return serves in large part, so the novel tells us, to give the creature physical substance in the real world. He is a kind of incarnation of Elishva's hopes. And these, in this quotation, these are the creature's own thoughts. I keep calling it the creature, not the monster. That's what Saadawi does, and it's probably always, I think, the best way to refer to Frankenstein's creation. These are the creature's own thoughts. Is that junk dealer really my father? Surely he's just a conduit for the will of our Father in heaven, as my poor mother Elishva puts it. She's a really poor old woman. They're all poor. And I'm the answer to the call of the poor. I'm a saviour, the one they were waiting for and hoped for in some sense. These unseen sinews, rusty from their use, have finally stirred. The sinews of a law that isn't always on the alert. The prayers of the victims and their families came together for once and gave those sinews a powerful impetus. The innards of the darkness moved and gave birth to me. I am the answer to their call for an end to injustice and for revenge on the guilty. Well, it may be so, and the creature may be a symbol of vengeance and justice twined together. But matters are not this simple, because the creature is put together from the residues of the dead But who is to say, as the creature himself muses towards the end of the novel, which of these residues are the remains of the guilty and which are the remains of the innocent? Just because you've been blown to bits by a bomb, that doesn't guarantee that you've lived a hitherto blameless life. So is the creature, if there really is a creature, composed of bits and pieces that are originally harmless? Or is he the summation of an entire community's guilt over its participation in mass slaughter? But it gets even more complicated. The creature regards it as his mission to kill the guilty on behalf of those among the innocent whose body parts are within him. But when he does this, it turns out that the relevant body part dies and has to be replaced. So who is to be chosen as a source of replacement? Again, how can one separate the innocent from the guilty? Frankenstein in Baghdad is an extremely complicated novel, even a postmodern one in the classic sense that the writer himself makes various appearances, as of course the author does in his bloody project. It's difficult to do it justice in this short time, but I'll move on to my next quotation, please, Tom, which concludes with a telling remark, apparently from the author himself. People in coffee shops spoke of seeing him during the day and vied to describe how horrible he looked. He sits with us in restaurants, goes into clothing shops or gets on buses with us, they said. He's everywhere and has an amazing speed, jumping from roof to roof and wall to wall in the middle of the night, they added. No one knew who his next victim would be. And despite all the assurances from the government, people grew more convinced with every passing day that he would never die. They were well aware of the stories of bullets passing through him. They knew he didn't bleed and didn't let anyone catch a glimpse of his face. The definitive image of him was whatever lurked in people's heads, fed by fear and despair. It was an image that had as many forms as there were people to conjure it. Although I had been immersed in this story for a long time, even I started to feel afraid. I think this paragraph provides as good an account as any of the entire Frankenstein mythos, which has of course been through many incarnations and rewritings since the early 19th century. It focuses on the creature's potential immortality, on our ability to remake the creature's physical form in almost any way we want, as we've seen in the countless film versions, on the essential link with fear, on the horror of ugliness, but also, and perhaps most interestingly, on the everydayness, the mundanity of the so-called monster. This last point initially puzzled me when I read the book, but then I came, I think, to see something of what Saadawi is saying. In a city like war-ravaged Baghdad, the sighting of deformity or mutilation is hardly strange at all. Indeed, it's the stuff of common life. Everybody is accustomed to the monstrous. Indeed, the monstrous, whether that be taken as a physical or an ethical term, is what is to be expected on every street corner. And I cannot refrain from saying that that appears to be entirely true now of Ukraine. There are, of course, points of serious difference with Mary Shelley's novel. Principally, the arrival of the creature is not seen as the arrival of one man's hubris, but rather as the outcome of the violent derangement of an entire social order. Furthermore, there is no science, no technology anywhere in the text. If Hardy the junk dealer has indeed put the creature together, then he has no more idea how he did it than we readers gain. He is not a seeker after knowledge, but yet another victim of incomprehensible forces beyond his control. But beyond that, we have, in a sense, a faithful recreation of Mary Shelley's controlling idea. An ugly creature, uncertain of his providence and shunned by all around him, turns into a figure of vengeance and terror. The difference, of course, is in the end a political one. Is what the creature does in Baghdad a justifiable response to the mayhem caused by international strife? Or is it simply part of the same unravelling tapestry, a necessary outcome of a situation where life has been cheapened and the body of the state and its armies and police forces have become the very essence of corruption? I'll conclude by trying to clarify, just for a moment, some of the main points I've been trying to make. Both of my chosen texts are essentially rewritings of previous ones, and this goes to the very heart of the Gothic. From the very beginning, Gothic texts have had or claimed to have uncertain origins. Horace Walpole's Castle of Otranto, to take perhaps the earliest example of all, claims not to be an original text, but rather a translation of an earlier work. This earlier work, we know, is entirely a figment of Walpole's imagination, but it raises the question of originality in stark form. Or to put it another way, we might ask whether the ghosts and terrors we find throughout Gothic are best explained as being produced by individual authors at all, or whether they are manifestations of age-old fears that have haunted cultures and civilizations over the centuries. His bloody project replicates the form of the Confessions of a Justified Sinner, but it also transposes the concerns of that earlier text in important ways. Where Justified Sinner is concerned with religious delusion and controversy, his bloody project is deeply embedded in an unjust social system that penalizes the poor. But in both cases, the question of justification is central. Are there moments of extremity that can justify killing? Or are these moments really excuses made up by disturbed individuals to provide a background for their monstrous actions? Frankenstein in Baghdad takes as its backdrop the earlier novel Frankenstein, but retells it as a story not about individual hubris, but about the consequences of a disturbed, even deranged society. But then again, is this really so different? What Victor Frankenstein tries to do is indeed, seen from one perspective, an outcome of his own alienation and intellectual pride. But maybe Mary Shelley was trying, as many critics have said, to point to this as an image for a wider alienation whereby our collective search for immortality and our collective fear of physical ugliness and deformity produce dire effects which in the end we are unable to control. In the end, both of these novels are about deprivation, about those who live or are forced to live outside the conventions of so-called civilized society. And this points, I think, to another very significant strand in the Gothic in general. It's often, and I think rightly been said, the Gothic is in a sense a mode of history. It's history told not from the side of those in power, but from the viewpoint of the powerless. Those who do not live in the bright world of enlightenment, but rather in the dark places which we strive to forget. The original Gothic arose, as I'm sure you know all too well, and as the conventional account goes, as a reaction against that moment in European thinking that we now refer to as the Enlightenment. And the crucial belief of the Enlightenment was in progress. in the idea that as science and technology move forward, so there will be a gradual overall improvement in the human condition. Gothic comes to remind us that there is another possible view, namely, that there are fears and terrors built into the human psyche that never go away, but instead return, recycle in different forms throughout human history. In this respect, of course, we can sense Gothic's kinship with one of the main things that Sigmund Freud said about the unconscious, namely that from the unconscious, nothing ever goes away. The unconscious is that part of the psyche that continually recycles motifs and themes from the earliest times in the individual mind and in the social consciousness. One of the commentators within the text of his Bloody Project says that Roderick's actions are not his alone, but the effect of poverty and injustice. So that as long as there are such things, there will always be the possibility of dire effects. In Frankenstein in Baghdad, the motif of injustice endures to the very end. The police, anxious to assign guilt for the various crimes attributed to the creature, decide that the simplest thing is to charge Hadi the junk dealer with them. But Mahmoud the journalist and his friends are far from convinced that he is the guilty party. Last quote, please, Don. One of Mahmoud's friends, known as Aziz the Egyptian, and I quote, saw the picture of his close friend, that is Hadi, on television and didn't recognize him. That wasn't Hadi the junk dealer. That's what most people in the coffee shop said too. But when they broadcast recordings of the criminal's confessions, the voice was very similar to Hadi's. How could he be a murderer? Seeing Hadi's disfigured face on television while sitting with his family at home, Mahmoud al-Sawadi thought this was just another massive mistake. They wanted to close the case in any way possible. It was inconceivable that this elderly man was a dangerous criminal. He had sat with him for hours. He was just a drunkard with an unstable personal life and a powerful imagination. And so even at the very end, we remain uncertain, as in so many Gothic narratives, as to what the true events might have been, or even what we have or have not seen. And that's where I ought to finish. Gothic itself is an unstable form, where hallucinations and phantoms can be entertained rather than being dismissed. Gothic is sometimes said to be a rather simple form of writing, all black and white, good and evil. But in fact, it probes the deep uncertainties of the human psyche and has served historically, as it still does, to disturb our assumptions about the simplicities of truth and to help us to see that there are many different accounts of events, many different perspectives on the truth, even if some of them involve forms of supernatural explanation that we prefer not to entertain, or assertions of social injustice that may be painful to contemplate. Thank you very much indeed for your attention.
Thank you very much, David. Thank you for that hugely thought-provoking, detailed and wide-ranging talk. You were interweaving evocative reflections on Gothic with two brilliant contemporary texts and inviting us to think big and exciting thoughts, I think, about the Gothic and its relevance as well today. You talked about uncertain origins, the problematizing of originality. You talked about how Gothic writers are bringing together social versus, in some ways, individual quandaries, dramatizing social situations as much as particular crimes or misdemeanors with Frankenstein, and also, of course, with the Hogg text you referenced. You were kind of showing us a gathering Gothic image, I suppose, in some ways, and you concluded by talking about Gothic as a mode of subaltern history in which nothing ever goes away, a kind of lossless mode. You gave us wonderful images of labyrinth and flight. So thank you very much, David, for that fantastic talk. Do we have questions for Professor Punter? Perhaps if no one has one ready just yet, maybe perhaps I can take chair's privilege and go first, David. I wanted to ask you a question about something you said right towards the end there. You mentioned that Gothic writing has often been thought to be, in some ways, all black and white, or conventionally has been described as something simple. I think you showed us today that clearly isn't the case. But I just wanted to ask you about, particularly thinking about His Bloody Project, how much pressure a different genre, perhaps, or a related genre of detective fiction, how much pressure is that putting on a text like His Bloody Project? And what I mean is, in a way, you very evocatively said these texts are labyrinthine and we can never arrive at a truth. But especially with His Bloody Project, the construction of the trial seems to be inviting us to kind of solve this long, cold case. It's almost like a kind of a true crime podcast, and perhaps there are kind of minority reports, or there's only theories of the case that are put forward that get kind of squashed by both sides in the legal case. The idea that it's all about Flora, really, rather than about Lachlan Broad. So I just wanted to invite you to kind of reflect on that. How much of the effect of that text, particularly, do you think has to do with something that's also kind of about law, about a kind of a obvious insufficiency of perfect evidence, but on the other hand, a need in some way to decide if justice is to be done.
Yeah, thanks very much indeed for that. It's a complex question. My initial thought about it is that the classic detective story, and of course there are now many variations on that, but with the classic detective story, let's think Sherlock Holmes, then we are, as readers, invited to accompany a reliable detective who is going to end up by discovering the truth. Now, of course, a lot of more recent detective stories have played lots and lots of riffs on that. I think of China Mieville and lots of other writers where the detectives are less than reliable. Of course, there's a whole tradition of American detectives. Take Philip Marlowe, who are extremely unreliable in some ways. They live unreliable personal lives, but they're still pretty reliable when you expect them to come at the truth. However, having said that, I think what you're touching on there, Tom, is a wider question, which is to what extent we should be thinking of Gothic as a genre at all, or rather as quite sure how to put it, but lots of texts, lots of novels, poems have Gothic moments. Gothic happens within other texts, and I'm reminded of the part of the earlier Gothic. If you think of early 19th century theatre evenings, for example, where you would have a Gothic play or a Gothic sketch or a Gothic scene going on in a theatre as part of a mixed programme. You'd also have a comedy, you'd have dancing, you'd have all manner of things, you'd have spectacle and so on and so forth. And Gothic was seen as one thing among others, as it were. And although obviously all of us here, and certainly me, do think of Gothic as a genre, and I think it is in one sense the right way to think about it. I think in another sense, Gothic has been continually, perhaps the right word is bleeding into, or being bled into, by other genres over the centuries, and detective fiction is obviously one. I mean, if we think of Wilkie Collins or Sheridan Le Fanu, then their Gothic novels are as much detective fiction as they are Gothic, I suppose one might say. So that's not at all a conclusive answer, just a set of thoughts on that. But I think the question of whether the text is suggesting you will get at the truth or not, I think is an important factor there. And of course, another way of looking at that would be through the rhetoric of verification techniques. What are the verification techniques in Gothic, and do they mesh with those in detective fiction, or are they at odds there? So that's just yeah. Mm-hmm.
Thanks very much, David. Thank you for that great answer. We have two questions, I think, waiting for you now. Let's come first of all to Quinten van der Waal. Would you like to ask a question?
Hello, good evening. Professor Punter, thank you for a very fascinating talk. I wanted to start with a remark on your ruminations about the genre and the development of the Gothic genre. I think what is kind of helpful, or what I find helpful, and really makes sense what you say, is Alistair Fowler's theorization of the genre, where he distinguishes between the kind, which is how we would conventionally define genre, but then also distinguishes the mode, which is that moment when a genre has become so well defined and so common that at some stage, what you said, that bleeding effect, that it turns into something that can modally transform or subvert or alter in some sense a text that is generically defined as different. So that's immediately what I thought when you said that. And then secondly, and here's my question, I'm very fascinated about the framing that happens in the bloody project, his bloody project, because that's very much a return to that, or a play on those Gothic frames that the traditional Gothic likes so much. And what fascinates me here, connecting to your labyrinth theme, is that the frame seems to establish this idea, that authoritative frame with the account. Because I haven't read the novel, so I hope I extracted that information correctly. So moving into this story, the frame seems to establish a certain authority and certainty, which is then, as you move in and you're taken in by this labyrinthine, it kind of subverts and deconstructs the authority of the expert voices from the inside almost. Is that a correct impression that I have? Or?
It's very interesting. Yeah. Well, I'm not sure that I've ever fully put this another way. The distinctions between genre, mode, and kind, I think, are really interesting, but I'm not sure I've ever fully understood them, because I think there is so much hybridity around Gothic and around, well, all literary forms really. I mean, and especially I think around the question of the supernatural, because there are clearly some forms of novel into which to intrude the supernatural would be a gross disruption of expectation. And that you could use that to great effect, but it would be a very difficult thing to do. I mean, if you think of a novel by, say, excuse me, Martin Amis or Ian McEwan, to suddenly produce a ghost would be really weird. You could produce a ghost, but you'd have to explain that ghost as the product of not necessarily delusion or hallucination, but certainly as imagination on the part of some character or other. You couldn't just produce a ghost, and I think that might be a kind of touchstone for what modes you can produce a ghost in. And indeed, to go back to the detective story, of course you can produce ghosts. You make them very, very convincing, but in the end, they do have to be explained away. And it goes right back to the earliest distinctions about the Gothic, about the explained and the unexplained supernatural. The unexplained supernatural is probably the least hybrid of the aspects of the Gothic, I think, where it's left there in the text as unexplained. However, having said that, it seems to me there's now a kind of convergence with some kinds of postmodernism whereby nothing is explained. So the unexplained supernatural is back with us. So this is a very complex matter, Quinton. I'm not sure I can go much further than that. What you said about the flame, I think, is interesting because you could argue that James Hogg and his bloody project goes some way to deconstructing that frame, that the frame no longer entirely holds the picture. And I'm trying to think. I mean, there were artists in the mid 20th century, and I can't think quite who I'm thinking of, but ones who very deliberately. Am I thinking about some aspects of Cubism, who very deliberately deconstructed the frame or brought it within their paintings? But of course, that now appears quite archaic, because now a lot of artists don't use frames at all. You know, there are no frames, and I think I have seen a couple of works of art which have a frame inside the picture, and then the picture is outside. So we've done all of those changes now, I think, through deconstructing the frame. Although it still remains an interesting set of images, isn't it? What is frame and what is within the frame? I hope that's.
Yeah, I guess I was also thinking more along the lines of the Castle of Otranto, where it's, I guess, frame the pretext, that kind of that historical context that is created to give it the fiction of reality, and that is left. But of course, by the time we get to James Hogg, the frame is used to complicate and not distract, but confuse as much as try to give it a sense of not even stability, but an entry point, as you say.
And M.R. James's ghost stories, some of them are masterpieces of deconstructing the frame, so that there appears to be a frame of an ancient manuscript and so forth, but when you look at it, it crumbles into dust and was never there in the first place, and the frame is dissolved. No.
Thank you.
Okay.
Yes, M.R. James in the mezzo tint, where there's the dead body that sort of keeps coming closer into the foreground and then sort of escapes the frame too. Frames is also not only, well, we've mentioned frames in relation to the Castle of Otranto, of course. Within the Castle of Otranto, famously, there's a frame which frames kind of a moment from Shakespeare, the ghost walking out of the frame. Maybe that leads us to another question we have here from Hanja, who's asking your expertise, David, in some ways about Shakespeare and Gothic. His question, I'll just read aloud the question that's in the chat. Hanja asks, can we define Hamlet as containing Gothic elements, although it contains clear details about a court, a royal court? Sorry, I just lost half of the question. But it still involves madness, vengeance, and fear. Okay, so the question for you there, I think, is, is there a Shakespearean ambience perhaps in Gothic, and also in these particular texts, perhaps?
Yeah. Well, actually, Hanji, that's a very interesting question, because it latches on also to what I was saying about texts with Gothic elements. Right. Well, I think my main answer would be yes, Hamlet does contain Gothic elements, and in particular one Gothic element, namely the ghost. There is the ghost, and it is an archetypal ghost, a ghost that's resonated down the centuries, the ghost of Hamlet's father. the question of whether we refer to that as Gothic is, I think, a very interesting one, because, of course, in a sense, we think of Gothic as being a historically and geographically bounded cultural phenomenon. And we speak of Gothic beginning with Castle of Otranto and so forth, and we speak of Gothic as persisting to the present day. Then, of course, over these last, I don't know, 40, 50 years or so, we've been exploring the different ramifications of what Gothic might actually mean. And in the name of that, we've gone much wider geographically: international Gothic, global Gothic, Gothics of all continents, actually. And historically, we have also used Gothic as a way of going back behind the 18th century. I'm not sure whether that matters very much. I think that it's more a question of what motifs are Gothic. And of course, the major Gothic motif is the ghost. And Hamlet's father is the archetypal ghost. In many ways, and I won't go into them all now, there isn't time, but the most obvious one is this, that Hamlet has been performed, as you probably know, with a physical actor portraying the ghost, and it's been performed without a physical actor portraying the ghost. The only thing that those productions have in common, and I think it's rather intriguing, is that the ghost must have a voice. Obviously, all the acts and scenes wouldn't happen. But the physical question is left in abeyance. Now, how true that is to Shakespeare, I don't know. I mean, my understanding, and I am not a Shakespearean scholar, my understanding is that the ghost was portrayed on stage in the earliest productions, but I could be corrected on that. But I think he probably was. Then again, so was the bear in The Winter's Tale. So, sorry, I think I'm rambling a bit. To come back to your question, yes, we can define Hamlet as containing Gothic elements. Yes, I think we can. You're saying even though it is in some ways quite a realistic play, and I think that's true. And then you go on to these other Gothic motifs: madness, vengeance, and fear. Yes, absolutely. Although I suppose you could argue that those motifs are even more pungently expressed in Macbeth, which I suppose some would say is a play that a Shakespeare play that contains even more Gothic elements than Hamlet.
Thanks, David. I think the next question is from Diana.
Yes, hi. I hope you don't mind. I am from the Department of Media and Communication, so I am more of an outsider, not an expert. What is the, and forgive me if my question might sound naive or too broad, but what is the relationship between violence and Gothic? Or does Gothic need violence?
I think I would say that Gothic needs transgression. I think that would be a more general term. There isn't a great deal of actual physical violence in Castle of Otranto. There's a lot of threat. And in Radcliffe, there is very little accomplished violence, but a great deal of threat or menace. And that threat or menace of transgressing boundaries, in the early Gothic texts, those boundaries are often boundaries of, actually, the boundaries that are referred to in his Bloody Project, boundaries of consanguinity, which essentially means incest. Yeah, I mean that's a tremendous theme in the early Gothics. So there's the threat. I don't know that there's very much actual incest in the early Gothic as I can recall. There probably is in some of the more lurid melodramatic stage plays, but not in the major works. But I think the threat of violence, menace, I think is integral to the early Gothic, and I think to more recent Gothic. In terms of actual violence, then of course, Gothic now covers all manner of extraordinary violent films and indeed TV series. I mean, the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, I suppose, is a Gothic film. It's also exceptionally violent. But I don't think violence is integral to the Gothic. No, not violence in a physical sense. I mean, splatter movies, yeah, these have all become departments of the Gothic, as it were, and become not departments, but annexes of the Gothic, I think. It goes back really, I suppose, to the oldest distinction of all in Gothic between horror and terror. Terror is about psychological fear, about menace and threat. Horror is about actually, we now call it body horror, is actually about violence to the body. They're both there in Gothic, but in very different ways, I think. Does that help at all?
Yes, it does. But sorry, this is connected. But there is a lot of blood. So there is a lot of blood, but not that much violence.
Yeah. Well, there's certainly a lot of blood. Well, in my two texts, there is blood and violence, it turns out. The mention of blood, of course, is interesting there in a different way, because if you think of blood in its complex ramifications of, say, for example, the bloodline and the hereditary, as well as blood in the physical sense of what comes pumping out of your arteries and veins if you're stabbed, then that takes us straight to Dracula, where the Count has a great deal to say about blood and about how the blood of the Magyars, as you said, flows down through generations and so forth. So and that would take one into a whole issue about vampirism and blood as connecting as much as separating. This is very, very complicated. You can have blood links without necessarily violence. I'm at the moment watching the TV series A Discovery of Witches. Have you seen that? There's an interesting motif in that about vampires, and about some vampires, apparently the bad vampires, not the vegetarian vampires, who have something called blood rage.
Very much.
Okay, great. Yes, just to spell out something David was saying there, the horror terror distinction, that's Radcliffe, am I right, David, in her essay on the supernatural in poetry, and what she's responding to is Matthew Monk Lewis, where there are those famous scenes of much more kind of disgustful, grotesque sort of body horror, and also famously religious violence too, with the burning down religious buildings and so on. So yeah, absolutely, violence and Gothic are central in the way that you were saying, David. The other question we have here is from Shiyu, which is in the chat, so I'll just vocalize it for us. This is from a student, I think, of mine on my Gothic module at the moment. Shiyu says, when I told my friend we were going to study the movie Dune for Gothic, she was like, "How is that Gothic?" Now I learn more about Gothic, especially Gothic lore. I feel like it's so much closer to us than I imagined. Can you, David, talk more about contemporary Gothic? Like, how can we apply Gothic?
Well, Shiyu, I sympathise with what you're saying, because ever since the first lockdown, I've been attending a Zoom group of Gothic scholars on a Sunday afternoon, for which we've been watching films and reading texts. And I've now come to a point where I think I agree with what you first say there. I feel like almost everything can be read as Gothic. And this is rather worrying, because it might mean we're losing our critical faculties. I would come back partly to what I said just now, which is that many texts, film, TV, literature, have Gothic elements. We don't have to classify them as Gothic for that. It's interesting that in bookshops in the UK, we have sections in Waterstones, including, of course, fantasy, science fiction, and something called dark romance, which covers vampires and all that kind of stuff. Not Gothic. Gothic's never been a bookshop category, which I think is quite good, really, because it allows Gothic a greater flexibility, I think. So I think I think the short answer to your question is that you yourself have to come to some critical distinctions as to what you think is Gothic and what isn't. And in order to do that, I take it you'll have to have some thoughts about what is essential to the Gothic text. And I think that's really hard, but I think that's the only way of going about it. But what I want to come back to you about is what you mean here about Gothic law. What is Gothic law? Hello?
Shu, do you want to reply to what is Gothic law?
Hi. It was in the PPT in my bloody project.
I see.
I think she was referring to something that I said in a lecture about this text, which was largely building on things that you said about his bloody project, David. Gothic is about, we talk about the Gothic law, the Gothic constitution, but in his bloody project, we've got law in a different sense. I think you've argued this. We've got, the court case kind of law that doesn't seem anything like the idealized, perfect, or ancient constitution of.
I see.
Gothic
Yeah,
law.
yeah. So yeah, I see. So what you what you're meaning here, Shiu, is the law, the process of the law, considered from a Gothic perspective. Yeah. Which I mentioned as maybe originating. Certainly, a very early example was Caleb Williams, where you are totally where the individual's encounter with the law amounts to a more or less total entrapment. And of course, it's something that Dickens satirizes in many of his novels, but in the case of Jarndyce and so on and so forth, whereby once you get into the process of the law, then you disappear from sight. You're either locked up in prison or you end up in an endless linguistic and legal battle to find out what the truth might be. Yeah, no, I understand that. Yeah. And I think it's interesting that in English literature, I think that sense of the punitive, inescapable trammels of the law does really begin in the 18th century when Gothic begins, and so there is something of an entanglement there, I think, and I think of Kafka, obviously, and of a whole literature which is around the inescapability of the law once you get within its confines. The question of whether you would call Kafka, to take that example, Gothic, I think again is one of these complex definitional ones. So, I mean, it depends what definitions of Gothic you prefer. Although I think it's interesting, I think people would hesitate to call Kafka Gothic, and I think that there's a certain kind of literary snobbery involved there, because Kafka is so universally regarded, and rightly, as a seriously major author, that to apply the term Gothic to him would seem somehow slightly demeaning. I come back to this notion that Gothic is sometimes seen as a rather black and white form. It's seen as a slightly degraded form of literature. Yes, I don't know if that's true, but I'm trying to sense the hesitancy around around classifying Kafka as Gothic. Anyway, sorry, but he's certainly to do with the terror of the law. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Thanks. We have a next question. I think we have time for just for two more questions. I think next question from Rosalind. Rosalind, you've written this in the chat. Would you also like to vocalize your question, Rosie?
Oh yeah, sure. Hello. So as I've written in the chat, it's quite a tangential question, but I'm interested in the Oceanic and Littoral Gothic, and I attend a reading group each month about it. And I was just wondering if you would consider Oceanic Gothic as part of the same literary tradition as like Land Gothic, or an annex of that tradition. And then if it is, should we be mapping it along the same kind of literary tradition? So does Otranto really fit with the littoral Gothic agenda, or do we need to look to other kinds of texts? So I was thinking about maybe like Roderick Random or Robinson Crusoe even as like a different literary tradition for a different type of Gothic. Thank you.
Well, that's really interesting. Yes, have you read that there was a recent issue of Gothic Studies called Nautical Gothic? You know that? Yeah.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah. I don't really know how to answer. I don't think. I think I think that the sea conjures in us its own anxieties, which are different from littoral or land anxieties. Terrors, indeed, the terror of the deep. I don't know how far back that goes, but I think we can probably find it, can't we, in Homer? I think we're looking at a very ancient and embedded terror of the deep, and a terror, of course, of what might come from the deep onto land, and then I'm thinking of Lovecraft, and a terror of what we might find at sea which shouldn't be there, and I'm thinking there William Hope Hodgson and his fungus-infected floating hulks, which are beyond all human concern. There's a whole collection of sea terrors there. I don't think I've ever thought of them as a tradition quite, or indeed as an annex, but as one. I mean, there's an interesting book by a man called Giblet called Postmodern Wetlands, which has a lot to say about our fears and anxieties of marshes, swamps, fens, and so forth. So I suppose, in a sense, we're scared of almost everything. You know, the deep waters are a major fear, but they don't affect everybody in the way that our fears of I don't know, of what might happen in our own houses might affect us. So there are more haunted houses than there are haunted ships, but there are plenty of haunted ships, and plenty of legends and myths around haunted ships. You know, Mary Celeste, and then of course the Sargasso Sea, and what might be lost there, and so on and so forth. You could go another way, go more with Freud, and say that in fact it's in the sea, in the oceanic, that we experience our deepest fears. And that may well be so, because what's lost at sea, an argument would go, is endlessly lost. It will never be refound, never be reclaimed. Not true, of course, as we've just seen about what was it the other week? Shackleton's ship, wasn't it, was discovered on the seabed in Antarctica. Sorry, that's rather irrelevant, but so I think that we are beginning to see a lot more interest in oceanic Gothic, and we'll see where it takes us. Whether that exactly how that's akin to the sea adventure story, which has its own long tradition, I would hesitate to say. I remember when I was at school, 50 years ago, longer actually, but I'm pretending it was 50 years. Whenever I won something in a sort of school competition or whatever, there would always be a sea story which I got. Percy Westerman and G.A. Henty. These people are now forgotten. However, I'm now wittering on. Thank you for the question.
Thank you.
One last question, and to pick up the theme of presence and absence, this is from Alice, who had to leave us early, but she left a question before she went. It's this. She said, I think the thing that I find most chilling about His Bloody Project, the Graeme Macrae Burnet novel, is its title, says Alice. What status does that word project give to Roderick's actions after the event, I wonder? Like Hogg's novel, the title seems to deliver a kind of posthumous judgment on the events. Why does Professor Punter think Burnet's novel is named as it is?
Well, as Alice said, it's because the words occur within the text itself. The word project, yes, it is interesting. I think that the word project is there because it's part of an assertion on the part of the lawyers that this was all a deliberate crime. A project is something which a man or a person, sorry, in their sound mind can entertain as an idea and then carry out. A project is not something spur of the moment. So I think that the word project is designed in the text to emphasize the claim that Macrae was in full command of his own senses when he planned and undertook these crimes. So I think that's the answer to the word project. But I mean, the title does remain interesting in other ways as well. I think His Bloody Project, not a bloody project. Again, you can say that's the term used in the text itself, but it does make for a very distinctive title, doesn't it? I've always felt that, though I never really thought very hard about it. His, I suppose the his again sort of pins it entirely on the individual. It emphasizes his responsibility for what he has done. So it's his project, and then the word bloody in between that emphasizes the bizarreness and the violence of what this project has actually been. Yeah. Now, I'm pleased to have my attention called to the title. It's interesting. Yeah.
Thank you, David. I said that will be the last question, so I'm afraid I will say we've come to an end of our time today. Just to quickly, before we go, just to cast forward to the next one of these Romantic Horizons talks. In 2 weeks' time, we're going to have a talk from Professor Gregory Ledbetter speaking about Coleridge, poetic faith, and the secret life of poetry. So please do, everyone present, please do join us again for that. Can I just remind us all to say thank you again to Professor David Punter and give him a round of applause, and then we'll call an end to today's meeting. Thanks, David.
Thank you all very much indeed. Hope you found that worthwhile, and good luck with your studies. Thank you.